Thank you for joining me. Today we're going to take a second look at this immensely important and precious psalm, Psalm 51. Last time I showed you how one of the ways we can divide this psalm up, and we can take the first three sections, verses 1 to 9, as one unit, all of which in a sense David is pleading for forgiveness and for cleansing from his sin. But I'm breaking this one section into three. We looked last time at verses 1 to 2, when David appeals for forgiveness based on the nature of his sin, his transgressions, his sin, his iniquity, but above all on the character of the mercy of God. We go a step further in verses 3 to 6, which we're looking at in this study, where David lays clear that he's fully aware of the nature of the problem of sin. I want you to notice three things from these verses. I want you first of all to notice how David owns his sin. This was also true of 1 to 2, but I want to bring it out here. Again and again, David doesn't speak only about transgressions or sin or iniquity. He speaks about my transgressions, my sin, my iniquity. There's no passing of the buck. There's no purely theoretizing what's going on here. David owns it. He admits it. He confesses it. He takes responsibility for sin. That's a massively important thing we need to bear in mind, to own our sin and to call it sin, as David does. Secondly, I want you to notice that David understands the real horror of sin. See, David's sin, particularly with Bathsheba, was one of a whole series of dreadful events that worked themselves out. Bathsheba herself, she was obviously abused by David. Uriah was murdered by David's accomplices. The whole nation of Israel came under the judgment and discipline of God because of David's sin. David wronged many, many people. But notice what he says in verse 4, against you, God, you only have I sinned. That's what sin is. You cannot define or understand sin apart from its relationship to God. Sin is sin because it is an offense against God. When we wrong and harm others, it's not quite sin in the same sense. We can wrong, we can harm them, we can offend them, we can cause them great injury, but it's not really sin in the same way that we sin against God. That's what makes sin so horrendous. We break God's law. And thirdly, I want you to notice here that David understands the real nature of his problem. You see, he says in verse 5, I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me. David understands that he is not a sinner because he sins. He sins because he is a sinner. David believed in, though he would not have necessarily understood the term, he believed in the biblical doctrine of the original sin. Every human being born into this world is born a sinner. We are conceived as sinners. Not that the conception is sinful, but that we are sinners because we inherit our fallen nature. And David understands, as we'll see particularly in the next few verses, that he doesn't need forgiveness just for the deeds that he does, but he needs his whole nature dealt with by God, because it's his nature that is the problem. He is a sinner. He would believe in the doctrine of total depravity, radical pollution, that every part of his being is corrupted and perverted by this all-pervasive disease of sin. One thing you can't escape in Psalm 51 is that David has a biblical understanding and a personal appreciation of how awful sin really is. And may we share that with him. The Lord bless you until our next study.